but it is a means of getting round the fact that the law does not permit divorce. And so, in effect, it is the same as divorce, though rather less honest. And we know that it is happening frequently in the Philippines. And so, this is a subject which, unpalatable though it may be, yet we are right to consider as we come to it here in the teaching of our Lord. Now, in order to understand our Lord's teaching in these two verses, we need first to consider the background of the Old Testament teaching on divorce, because it is against that background that our Lord is speaking. What then did the Old Testament have to say about divorce? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that divorce in the Old Testament was not on account of adultery. Adultery was not a ground for divorce, for the very good reason that under the Old Testament law, the penalty for adultery was death, and the adulterer was put to death. And so the whole question of divorce did not arise. And naturally, if your spouse was put to death by the state on the grounds of adultery, the surviving partner was of course free to remarry. And the whole issue of divorce and remarriage following adultery simply did not arise. However, there was divorce in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament allowed marriage to be terminated for other reasons. Let me read to you Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favour in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends it out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, notice that this has got nothing to do with adultery. It simply says that when a wife finds no pleasure in her husband's eyes because the husband has found something objectionable, and it's very vague what it actually is, this objectionable thing. Her husband has found something objectionable about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, etc. The main point that is being made is that that must be final. If she goes off and marries somebody else, she cannot come back. The main point that is actually being made in that teaching is that you cannot jump in and out of marriage. If you divorce your wife for whatever reason it might be, you must give her a certificate to that effect and send her from the house. But then, once she's been with another man, it's too late to change your mind. You cannot simply say, oh, let's make up, and she comes back. And the law clearly here is primarily intended to regulate human sinfulness in this kind of behavior. At the time of the New Testament, there were disputes among leading rabbis as to what constituted valid grounds for a divorce. Rabbi Hillel, one of the great Jewish rabbis, taught that a man might legitimately put away his wife if she spoiled his food by overcooking it or by adding too much salt. That was something objectionable in her, and he might validly put away his wife for that objection. Rabbi Akiba interpreted the words, if it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, he said that, well, that might very well be because he's found another woman who is more attractive than his wife. And so his wife no longer finds favor in his eyes, and he may put her away. These were the kind of discussions that were taking place among the rabbis in Jesus' day. There was another rabbi who took the view that this was frivolous and wrong, and that divorce should in fact only be where there had been adultery. But you see the kind of thinking that was going on. And men were appealing to Deuteronomy 24, which we'll look at more closely in a moment. They were appealing to this as a reason for getting rid of your wife for virtually any ground whatsoever. Now, an honest reading of Deuteronomy 24 makes clear that God is not sanctioning in a positive way this kind of divorce. He did not desire this among his people. He is making a concession. He is permitting it because of men's hardness of heart. The law accepted that people did this kind of thing, and so they put restraints and restrictions upon it. But there is no positive commendation here at all that in such circumstances a man should put away his wife. It simply says if he does so, then he must not take her back again if he changes his mind. We are reminded that the Old Testament law permits things of which God did not approve. For example, the Old Testament law permitted polygamy. Many of the Old Testament men had more than one wife. But the Old Testament never commends that. It was a departure from human life as revealed in the beginning of Genesis. But the Mosaic law accepted that that happened, and it regulated and it controlled it by at least making sure that if he took a second wife, that he treated her on an equal footing with the earlier wife. But it's not until we come to the New Testament that in the New Testament we find polygamy utterly forbidden. In the qualifications for office in the church, 1 Timothy 3:2, a bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife. Verse 12, let deacons be the husbands of one wife. And even more explicitly, 1 Corinthians 7:2, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. The only way that each man can have his own wife and each woman her own husband, if each man has one wife and each woman has one husband. And that, of course, takes us back to the original pattern when God created man. He created a man and one wife for that man. But the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, permitted for the time being this practice which was not in accord with God's will. And it is the same with divorce. Because of the hardness of men's hearts, the Mosaic law permitted divorce, but regulated and circumscribed it. But now, our Lord in the New Testament is rescinding that permission. He's taking us back to the original creation in which there was no divorce. And all of this is argued by our Lord himself in Matthew chapter 19. Please turn for a moment to chapter 19 of Matthew, and we'll read verses 3 to 9. Matthew 19, verses 3 to 9. The Pharisees came to him, testing him, and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" You see, that's the point that the rabbis were discussing. And now they're putting it to Jesus. What's your view of this matter? Can we divorce our wives because she burns our food? And Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'? So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses give us command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" Jesus said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And so you see, our Lord's answer to the question about the legitimate grounds for divorce, he does not go back to Deuteronomy 24. He goes right back to Genesis chapter 2. And he explains Deuteronomy 24 as being concessive, permissive. In view of the hardness of your hearts, Moses permitted you these things, but go back to Genesis, to God's original pattern, and it was not like that. God made the man and the woman. He declared them to be one flesh. He joined them together. Therefore, let no one separate them. And then in verse 9, he states pretty much the same as we've got in chapter 5 in the verses before us, that if you divorce your wife on any other ground than adultery and marry another, you are committing adultery. And the person who marries this woman who has been put away on some trivial ground, he likewise is committing adultery. So let's then turn back to Matthew 5 and to the verses which finally we're going to look at, verses 31 and 32. What does our Lord say here? "I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries such a woman who's been put away for some trivial reason, he commits